Imagine trusting your greatest hope to someone. Handing over your most intimate dream to someone who promises miracles. Now imagine discovering that the person who was supposed to care for you was actually a monster disguised as a savior. Roger Abdelmassih was born on October 3rd, 1943, in São João de Boa Vista, a town in the interior of São Paulo State, Brazil. Son of Lebanese immigrants, Olga and Jorge, he grew up surrounded by the comfort that the family's prosperous business provided. His parents were well-known merchants who sold products to the region's elite. From a very young age, Roger demonstrated a characteristic that would accompany him throughout his life: unbridled ambition. At school, being a good student wasn't enough. He needed to be the best. His classmates remember an intelligent boy, yes, but also extremely competitive and obsessed with status. His father, Jorge, began making strategic friendships with important clients and started negotiating family properties, ranches, and farms. Wealth increased, and with it, young Roger's sense of superiority also grew. He told everyone he would study medicine from elementary school onwards. But the small countryside town soon became too narrow for his ambitions. Roger convinced his father to let him move to São Paulo, where he would study at the renowned Bandeirantes school. There, for the first time, the young man who had always been the best discovered there were many like him, perhaps even better. He specialized in urology and began working. But Roger had a very specific criterion for his patients. He only treated rich and influential people. It wasn't just about money, it was about being close to power, fame, and recognition. Even so, at 24 years old in 1968, he graduated in medicine from Unicamp. During medical school, Roger already showed peculiar behavior. He only got close to people who could add something to his career. He had no friends, only useful contacts. In the late 70s, something revolutionary began emerging in the world of medicine: in vitro fertilization. And Roger saw there not an opportunity to help people, but to become rich and famous. He partnered with Dr. Milton Nakamura, who already worked with assisted reproduction. But the two had completely different motivations. Milton thought about how many women could finally realize their dream of being mothers. Roger thought only about how many zeros he could add to his bank account, and how many newspaper headlines would feature his name. The partnership didn't last long. The disagreements about how to conduct the work were too great. Roger decided to go solo and brought his clinic to São Paulo. He set up a luxurious office on Avenida Brazil, in an upscale area of the capital. His motto was, "Everything for a baby." And Roger was brilliant at personal marketing. He appeared on television programs, gave interviews, participated in events, always impeccably dressed, always with a confident smile, always promising miracles. He sold himself as someone who had the divine gift of bringing lives into the world. The numbers began to appear, and Roger promoted himself through them. He said his clinic had the best success rates in the country. Celebrities began seeking him out. Pele's wife, former President Fernando Collor, comedian Tom Cavalcanti, Senator Renan Calheiros, all trusted him. The most publicized case was that of TV host Gugu Liberado's twin daughters. Roger was everywhere, always as the star doctor, the man who made impossible dreams come true. By 2004, his net worth was around 100 million reais. But behind this impeccable facade, something very dark was happening inside that clinic. Roger's consultations had a pattern. He was extremely persuasive. He made patients visualize their future babies, gave them names, created enormous expectations, and charged absurd amounts. Many women spent the equivalent of a beach property's price to pay for treatment. And Roger insisted they purchase packages of 3 attempts at once. He manipulated them emotionally, putting patients against the wall. Do you prefer to see the ocean or your children's smiles? These women were mostly successful middle and upper-class professionals, between 30 and 40 years old. They invested all their savings in the dream of motherhood. They fully trusted Brazil's most famous doctor in assisted reproduction. What they didn't know is that they were entering a predator's office. Roger took advantage of these women's vulnerability in a monstrous way. During procedures when they were sedated, he raped them. The modus operandi was always the same. Patients needed to come to the clinic for daily hormone injections. At certain moments of treatment, they were sedated for procedures. It was in these moments that Roger acted. Some women woke up during the abuse. Vana Lopez was one of these women. She was a successful fashion designer, lived between Brazil and Europe, had a brilliant career. At 33 years old, married for 7 years and with an adopted daughter, she decided to try having a biological child. She sought Roger Abdelmassih's clinic full of hope. The consultations were filled with promises. He guaranteed she would leave there with twins. Vana visualized the babies, gave them names, created an entire life in her imagination. She was completely focused on the goal of being a mother. After 2 failed attempts came the third. Vana took the pre-procedure medication and was taken to the room. Then she woke up, and she saw Roger Abdelmassih on top of her, raping her. The physical and emotional pain was devastating. But the horror didn't stop there. Vana began feeling strong abdominal pains after the abuse. She was rushed to the hospital, where they discovered she was on the verge of a generalized infection. During the anal rape, Roger had introduced bacteria that rapidly multiplied throughout her body. Vana needed emergency surgery. She lost her fallopian tubes, ovaries, and with them the hope of having a biological child. The woman who entered the clinic dreaming of being a mother left mutilated, traumatized, and destroyed. But the worst part was still to come. In 1993, shortly after the crime, Vana went to a police station. She reported everything to the detective. And the response she received was devastating. He said she was delusional. He's the star doctor. He would never do that. The police report mysteriously disappeared. Vana's life completely fell apart. The successful businesswoman who traveled the world entered deep depression. She began eating compulsively to become ugly. She reached 150 kilograms. She stopped working, stopped leaving home, stopped seeing friends. She spent 4 years locked at home, not even going down to her building's lobby. Guilt consumed her. She self-sabotaged, believing she had somehow allowed it. She attempted suicide. But something inside her still resisted. A spark of anger and desire for justice. Vana wasn't the only victim. While she suffered in silence, Roger continued his routine. Every day, more women entered that clinic full of hope, and many of them left traumatized, not fully understanding what had happened. Some woke up during the abuse. Others had confused memories because of sedation. Many felt something was wrong but couldn't process it. And when they tried to report, they weren't believed. After all, who would believe the celebrity doctor was a rapist? Roger Abdelmassih's crimes occurred for years. There are reports dating back to the 70s, but officially registered crimes happened mainly between 1995 and 2008. Hundreds of women went through that clinic. Roger always took care to choose victims who, even though successful, didn't have the same power and influence as his famous clients. They were women who would work hard to pay for treatment, who were emotionally vulnerable due to their desire to be mothers. And he had a ready excuse for everything. When questioned about strange behaviors during procedures, he claimed that propofol, the anesthetic used, could cause sexual hallucinations. He said women confused dreams with reality. But in 2006, something began to change. An anonymous Orkut user known only as Iris created a community on the social network to talk about the abuse she suffered at Roger Abdelmassih's hands. For the first time, there was a space where victims could find each other. For 3 years, the accusations circulated mainly on the internet. Traditional media didn't touch the subject. Roger Abdelmassih was too powerful, too well-connected, too rich. Prosecuting or even investigating him seemed like a lost battle. Other women began appearing, each with a similar story. The same patterns, the same circumstances, the same aggressor. They realized they weren't alone, that they hadn't imagined anything, that they weren't crazy, that there was a predator acting systematically. But in 2009, everything changed. A Folha de São Paulo newspaper report finally brought the case to light. The number of accusations already exceeded 60 women from 3 different states. It was impossible to continue ignoring. The public prosecutor's office began investigating. The federal police started tapping Roger's phones and intercepting his messages. And what they discovered was shocking. In conversations with his psychiatrist, Roger called himself the Great Eater. He said he yielded to his patients' harassment. He treated the abuses with absolute cynicism, as if it were something banal. There was no remorse, no shame. Just a sick arrogance of someone who thought himself untouchable. Vanna Lopez, who had been discredited 15 years earlier, returned to the police station. This time she brought with her a copy of the police report she had filed in 1993. The detective was shocked to discover the original had disappeared from the files. With so many accusations and accumulated evidence, on August 17, 2009, Judge Bruno Paes Stranfarini of São Paulo's 16th Criminal Court ordered Roger Abdelmassih's preventive detention. He was accused of 56 rapes. The arrest was a national shock. The star doctor, the man who appeared on television promising to fulfill dreams, was actually a serial rapist. But Roger had resources and connections. On December 24th, after only 4 months imprisoned, he was released. Minister Gilmar Mendes of the Supreme Federal Court granted a habeas corpus that revoked the preventive detention. Roger began responding to the process in freedom. And he continued denying everything. He said he was persecuted by competitors, by dissatisfied patients. The trial was long and painful for the victims. 37 women had to relive their traumas in court. They had to face distrust, questioning, defense lawyers trying to discredit them. It was a brutal process of re-victimization. But on November 23, 2010, finally came the conviction. Judge Keneric Bujikian Felipe sentenced Roger Abdelmassih to 278 years in prison for 52 rapes against 37 women. It was one of the largest convictions for sexual crimes in Brazilian history. The victims cried with relief. Finally, after years of suffering, fighting, not being believed, justice had been done. Or at least that's what they thought. Roger appealed the decision. And again he obtained the right to await the appeal in freedom. He returned to his mansion in Jardim Paulista, one of São Paulo's most upscale neighborhoods. He returned to his luxury life as if nothing had happened. In January 2011, Roger went to the Federal Police Department to renew his passport. When the public prosecutor's office learned of this, they interpreted the gesture as a clear intention to flee. A new arrest warrant was requested. 2 teams from the Civil Police Special Operations Group went to Roger's mansion in Jardim Paulista. They staked out since dawn. They waited hours. But when they finally entered, they discovered it was too late. Roger Abdelmassih had fled. He appeared on Interpol's list of wanted criminals. He became one of the 25 most wanted criminals by São Paulo's civil police. But there was no sign of him. It was speculated he had fled to Lebanon, a country with no extradition treaty with Brazil. Roger had dual Lebanese and Brazilian citizenship. It was believed he had crossed the border into Paraguay, then Uruguay, and from there flew with a false passport to Lebanon. There he would be safe, untouchable, free to live the rest of his life in peace. The victims were devastated. Vanna Lopez, who had dedicated years of her life to seeking justice, felt everything had been in vain. The monster had escaped. In 2011, she created the United Victims Group, an organization to support women who suffered sexual violence. But Vanna didn't give up on finding Roger. She collected information, followed leads, maintained contact with authorities. The search lasted 3 years, 3 long years in which Roger's trail seemed to have completely disappeared. Roger's wife, Larissa Maria Sacco, had resigned from her position as federal prosecutor in 2011. She fled with her husband, taking the couple's twin children. 36 years younger than Roger, she had become his accomplice in flight. Meanwhile, Roger lived a life of luxury in Paraguay. He hadn't gone to Lebanon. He was in Asunción, the Paraguayan capital, living with his wife and children. He used the false name Ricardo Galeano, passing himself off as a Paraguayan businessman. He had nannies, a driver, security guards. He frequented exclusive restaurants. The children studied at a private school. For all intents and purposes, he was just another rich businessman living peacefully. But the mask was about to fall. The São Paulo Public Prosecutor's Office opened a new procedure to investigate suspicions of personal favoritism, ideological falsehood, and material falsehood involving Roger. During investigations, through phone taps, they discovered he was in Paraguay. The information was shared with the federal police, and on August 19, 2014, at 1:25 p.m., agents from Paraguay's National Anti-Drug Secretariat, in partnership with the Brazilian Federal Police, arrested Roger Abdelmassih. He was captured near the school where his children studied. He was disguised wearing a wig and glasses. But it didn't help. After 3 years as a fugitive, the star doctor had finally been captured. He would be summarily deported to Brazil. Roger arrived in Brazil through Foz do Iguaçu. From there, he was taken by plane to São Paulo. At Congonhas Airport, Vanna Lopez and other victims waited for him. They wanted him to see their faces. They wanted him to know they hadn't given up. When Roger got off the plane, handcuffed, Vanna was there. He looked at her, and she looked back without fear. Now he's gone, I can rest. He looked me in the face. I stayed close to him, and he saw I'm not afraid. May he live long now. May he rot in jail. Roger was transferred to Tremembe Penitentiary, in São Paulo's interior. The arrival was accompanied by the victims. They said things they had kept for years. They hoped he would find in prison someone who would do to him what he had done to them. In 2014, Roger's sentence was reduced to 181 years, 11 months and 12 days in prison. By Brazilian law, no one can serve more than 30 years. But for the victims, any reduction seemed like an injustice. Since then, Roger has repeatedly tried to obtain house arrest. He claims health problems: dilated cardiomyopathy, left ventricular systolic dysfunction, pulmonary arterial hypertension. His lawyers, including his wife Larissa, argue imminent risk of death. But justice has consistently denied. Medical reports indicate that Tremembe prison has adequate infrastructure to meet his health needs. And there's always the reminder that he fled once before. He's considered highly dangerous. In 2020, during the pandemic, Roger managed to obtain house arrest for a few months, claiming his age and health conditions put him in the risk group. But the benefit was quickly revoked after pressure from the public prosecutor's office and victims. Roger returned to Tremembe, where he remains today. He's 82 years old. He lives isolated in an individual cell in the medical sector. He receives few visits. He has no contact with other inmates. He spends most of his time under medical supervision. Sources linked to the public prosecutor's office describe his routine as silent and reserved. He can only apply for parole in 2047, when he would be 104 years old. He'll likely die in prison. Vanna Lopez, the first woman to report him, continued her fight. The United Victims Group became a national reference in welcoming victims of sexual violence. Vanna helped hundreds of women, victims of all types of heinous crimes. But in 2023, Vanna passed away. She was 62 years old and had been fighting breast cancer for 4 years. Because she contracted hepatitis from Roger Abdelmassih, she couldn't undergo chemotherapy. The disease spread. Metastasis in the ribs, pelvis, legs. Vanna died knowing the man who raped her, who destroyed her life, was imprisoned. But she also died carrying the consequences of that crime. She lost the possibility of having biological children. She lost years of her life to depression. Her body was marked forever. The Roger Abdelmassih case is one of the most shocking in Brazilian criminal history. Not only because of the number of victims, not only because of the brutality of the crimes, but because of how he used his position of power and trust to systematically abuse. He exploited these women's most vulnerable moment. The desperate desire to be a mother, the hope invested in treatment, the trust placed in the doctor. And he turned all of this into an opportunity to satisfy his sick impulses. The case also exposes systemic failures in protecting victims of sexual violence. How many times did Vanna and other women try to report and were discredited? How many police reports disappeared? How many accusations were ignored because the accused was powerful? Roger Abdelmassih didn't act alone in a vacuum. He was protected by a structure that values power, money, and status above women's safety. A structure that systematically discredits victims of sexual violence. Roger's victims weren't just vulnerable during medical procedures. They were vulnerable throughout society. Vulnerable to not being believed. Vulnerable to having their traumas minimized. Vulnerable to being blamed. Today, Roger is imprisoned. But the victim's suffering didn't end with his imprisonment. Many still carry deep traumas. Some never managed to have children. Others developed severe psychological disorders. All had their lives permanently marked. The case continues to resonate. In 2025, the series Tremembe, on Amazon Prime Video, brought the case to light again. Roger is portrayed by actor Anselmo Vasconcelos. The series shows his routine in prison and, in flashbacks, his crimes. For the victim, seeing the case portrayed is a complex experience. On one hand, it brings visibility to what they suffered. On the other, it forces them to relive traumas. But many believe it's important that the story be told, so it doesn't repeat. The Medical Council of São Paulo revoked Roger Abdelmassih's professional license on May 20, 2011. He's no longer a doctor. He lost the right to practice the profession he used to commit his crimes. But the consequences of his actions go far beyond revocation or imprisonment. They're in the destroyed lives, the shattered dreams, the traumas that never completely heal. They're in the women who still suffer, decades later. Roger always denied the accusations. He said he was persecuted by envious competitors, that the women were lying, that hallucinations caused by anesthesia confused the patients. He never admitted guilt. He never apologized. This lack of remorse is perhaps as disturbing as the crimes themselves. It shows a man completely devoid of empathy, incapable of recognizing the suffering he caused. A narcissist who until the end believes he's above consequences. Roger Abdelmassih's case is a somber reminder of how predators can hide in positions of authority. Doctors, teachers, religious leaders, anyone in a position of power can abuse that trust. It's also a reminder of the importance of believing victims. How many crimes could have been prevented if Vanna had been taken seriously in 1993? How many women could have been spared if the system didn't protect the powerful? The United Victims Group created by Vanna Lopez remains active. They work not only welcoming victims but also fighting for legislative changes. They want a victim statute that guarantees rights and prevents re-victimization in the judicial process. Roger Abdelmassih's story ends with him in a cell. But his victims' stories don't end. They continue living, fighting, rebuilding their lives. Some found strength to become activists. Others prefer silence and anonymity. All, however, share the experience of having trusted someone who should have cared for them and being betrayed in the most brutal way possible. All carry scars that will never completely disappear. But many also found strength they didn't know they had. The courage of Vanna Lopez and the other women who reported Roger cannot be underestimated. They faced the system, faced disbelief, faced public exposure. All so the truth would be known and justice would be done. Roger Abdelmassih remains imprisoned in Tremembe. At 82 years old, isolated, sick, he'll probably die there. His name, once synonymous with hope for couples dreaming of having children, is now synonymous with horror, abuse, and betrayal. The women he raped continue their lives. Some had children through other methods, others gave up the dream of motherhood. All learned to live with traumas no one should have to carry. And somewhere, perhaps there are still victims who never reported. Women who kept the trauma in silence out of fear, shame, or not believing they would be taken seriously. Women who saw Roger arrested and perhaps felt relief, but never told their story. The Roger Abdelmassih case is an open wound in Brazilian medicine's history. It's a reminder that not everyone who promises healing is there to heal. That behind diplomas and reputation, a monster can hide. But it's also a story of resistance. Of women who refused to be silenced. Who transformed pain into fight. Trauma into activism. Who made it so that in the end, despite all obstacles, justice prevailed. Roger Abdelmassih thought himself untouchable. He thought his power, his money, his connections would protect him forever. But he underestimated the strength of the women he raped. The determination of Vanna Lopez and the other victims was greater than any privilege. Today, when someone searches Roger Abdelmassih's name, they don't find the star doctor. They find a convicted rapist. The carefully constructed image over decades was destroyed, and the legacy he leaves is one of shame and horror. The victims, on the other hand, leave a legacy of courage. The United Victims Group helps hundreds of women every year. Vanna Lopez's fight inspired changes in how sexual violence cases are treated. The case continues to echo in Brazilian society. Whenever a case of abuse by a person in a position of power comes to light, Roger Abdelmassih's name is remembered as an example of what can happen when power isn't supervised. And so, while Roger Abdelmassih ages in a cell in Tremembe, the women he tried to destroy continue living. Some moved forward, others still struggle. But all, in one way or another, survived. This is the story of the doctor who promised miracles but delivered horror. Of the man who used hope as a weapon. Of the predator who hid behind a white coat. And of the courageous women who refused to let him escape unpunished. Roger Abdelmassih will be remembered not for the babies he helped birth, but for the lives he destroyed. Not for the hope he offered, but for the fear he caused. Not as a doctor, but as a monster. And that's the only justice history can offer.